Good morning. Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to another edition of PT on Ice. My name is Jason London. I am a faculty with the Institute for Clinical Excellence and teach rehabilitation of the injured runner as well as rehabilitation of the injured cyclist. And today I want to talk to you guys about training load and injury in runners. Um, Historically, it's been thought that runners are getting injured at a really high rate, if depending on the study that you look at, anywhere up to 90% of those training for a marathon will sustain a running related injury because of the demands of the sport of running, mainly the impact on the body, in that if training load is too high in terms of too much volume over the training week, or if training load is progressed too quickly, that's the main reason for runners developing an injury. And so historically, it's been thought that anyone who's running over 40 miles per week would be termed a high volume runner, and that they're in increased risk for developing a running related injury. And those who are increasing their training load by more than 10% per week are at increased risk for developing a running related injury. However, recently in the past 6 months, there's been several studies published that are kind of questioning those specific targets. This past September in the American Journal of Sports Medicine, the TRAILS study was published, which is a prospective study looking at a large number of runners, and they found that there was no difference in overall training volume between those runners who became injured and those who remained healthy. However, the average training volume was 20 miles per week, so not quite getting into that really high volume of greater than 40 miles per week that historically has been thought to lead to increased risk of injury. And what they did not look at, though, is at rate of progression of training, or what the progression of that training load was. And this past December, there was a meta-analysis published in the International Journal of Sports Medicine that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, that's conclusion can be a little bit misleading, or really just more misinterpreted. Their conclusion was very limited evidence exists supporting the sudden change in training load is associated with the increased risk in running-related injury. So one could interpret that perhaps in saying that there is no evidence to support that a sudden increase in training load increases the risk of a running-related injury. But that's really not the conclusion that this paper is showing. So this, again, is a systematic review. The title is there evidence for an association between changes in training load and running-related injuries? This was published this past December in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy, and by a Danish group. And what they did is they first started with their search and had several thousand studies to look at, but really only 4 studies met their inclusion criteria. So it was relatively small sample size. And 3 out of those 4 studies showed a link or an increased risk or rate of injury in those runners who increased their training load by more than 30% per week, compared to those runners who increase their training load by 10% or less per week. And so the 3 studies that did show the link, their cutoff was 30% in terms of the increased rate of progression, versus the 10% or less, which is kind of historically thought to be a safe progression of training load. And the one study that didn't show a link showed that runners who progressed their training load by 10% or less per week did not have a reduced risk of injury compared to those runners who increased their running volume by 24% per week. So again, that study didn't quite get to that 30% cutoff that the other studies were looking. All of these studies were looking at novice runners, so first-time runners, which is a good thing, because that's a population within a running population that is most likely to become injured. And the weekly training volume for these studies was all averaging at 10 kilometers or less per week, so pretty low volume. So from this study, again, their conclusion is a little bit, could be misinterpreted the way it's worded. So it still shows that there is an increased risk of developing a running-related injury if you're progressing training volume too quickly. However, that cutoff, which once was thought to be 10%, really looks to be that if you're under 30%, according to these studies in this meta-analysis, you're not at increased risk for developing a running-related injury for novice runners running at a low volume. And then, so to look at more experienced runners and those runners running a higher volume, there's a study that was published ahead of print on JSPT's website this past December. And that study was looking at, again, another prospective study, and actually from the same Danish group that published the meta-analysis. And if you're looking at epidemiology of running injuries, most of the studies you're going to find are either from the Danes or the Dutch. So they're really into doing these epidemiological studies, and they do them well over there. So this study is preparing for half marathon, the association between changes in weekly running distance and running-related injuries. Does it matter how the running is scheduled? Again, this is on JSPT's website and is published ahead of print. And so again, this is another prospective study looking at runners who are participating in this training, this Run 21, which is 21 kilometers or a half marathon research study. And all of them are healthy runners with no history of a running-related injury in the past 6 months. And they agreed to participate in the study and were followed then over a 2-year period to see, one, if the runners were getting injured, and two, what are some of the factors leading into that injury. In addition to looking at the progression of training load, so the progression of training volume week to week, they also tried to look at those runners who are training or progressing their training based more on volume. So they're doing a more volume-based schedule, so kind of a traditional training schedule, versus those runners who are doing more of a pace-related schedule. So they're doing more intervals, more speed work, and not necessarily progressing their volume each week. And what they found is so they had just over 250 subjects, and over the 2-year period, around 20% of those individuals became injured while training for a half marathon. And of those runners who became injured, they were most likely to become injured after the first 3 weeks of training. And those runners who became injured increased their mileage or volume between 20 to 60% compared to those who did not become injured, who increased their volume by less than 20%. They did not find this significant difference in those who became injured at the 8-week mark or at the 13-week mark based on progression of training load. And so this study would support that you still do not want to increase your training load or volume too quickly, too soon. However, it highlights a couple important parts. So number one is the runners were much more likely to become injured in the first 3 weeks of training. So this makes sense. For those of you who work with a running population, particularly if you're working with competitive runners at the high school or collegiate level, particularly with high school level, what do we see every fall when cross-country season is starting up right away? We get this rash of people coming in with medial tibial stress syndrome or shin splints. And that's because the kids are likely not doing the running volume, doing the training schedule that the coach gave them to do over the summer. They come into the season, the training season, or even preseason, and the coach is assuming they're doing the volume that they asked, and so they hit it out at a higher training volume than they're used to training, and then they develop shin splints. So we kind of see that a lot when someone's with a runner, when they're starting a new training program. They maybe get a little bit too enthusiastic with the training. They don't quite have the history of the volume underneath them to start that training schedule. And so if you're looking at it from that way, rather than increasing their training load 10% or less per week or 30% or less per week, they're really that first week increasing their training load by probably 100% or more for a lot of them. And so that rate of progression is heightened in that first 3 weeks as someone's starting a training program. So that this study would kind of support that those first 3 weeks seem to be the most the time period where runners are at most risk for injury. As I also alluded to with the study, they're trying to look at, is there a difference between those runners who do kind of the historical volume-based progression of a training plan versus a pace-based progression of a training plan. And they did not see a significant difference in those runners who did volume-based versus pace-based in terms of injury rates. They did see a trend, though, to fewer injuries in the pace-based group. And reasons for this would be that the pace-based group overall did a lower volume of their training compared to the volume-based group, as you would expect. And maybe the reason why they didn't find a significant difference is it really wasn't that big of a difference in the overall volume. So the runners that were doing the volume-based training schedule had right around 7 kilometers per run per their session over the average of the 13 weeks. Whereas the runners who were doing the pace-based running schedule had right around 5 kilometers. So, a 2 kilometer difference maybe isn't quite that threshold to where you're going to see a reduction in injuries. And so again, this was a study, prospective study. I had misspoke earlier saying that they followed them over 2 years. It was really just over 13 weeks, but prospectively following healthy runners training for a half marathon, and found that those runners who increased their training volume by more than 20% per week in that first 3 weeks were more likely to become injured. And again, these are not novice runners in this study, so different than the meta-analysis we talked about earlier, and training at a higher volume than the runners in that meta-analysis too. But still, overall, a pretty low volume if you're considering that the average run was 7 kilometers per session, so under 5 miles per run. When, again, looking at the majority of recreational long-distance runners, at least in my community, is training at a much higher volume than that. So the takeaways from these studies is that increasing volume or increasing training load too quickly certainly can lead to an increased risk of developing a running-related injury. It may not hold true to the historical 10% rule. Looks like we can get away with, in novice runners, less than 30% per week, and in those runners who are doing a training volume for a half marathon, less than 20% per week. So, thanks for listening today. I hope you all have a great Friday and a great weekend. And those of you in the polar vortex, stay warm. And if you're interested in learning more about running-related injuries or just any sport-related injuries, I'll be teaching through virtual ice next week or next month on throwing injuries, and then the big yearly event of The ice sampler is going to be down in Vegas in April, so I'll be at that as well. And then teaching a running course at the end of April in Montana and in May in Chicago. So thanks for listening. Have a great Friday.